Hello and welcome back, future scientists. Thank you so much for making it to class today. I'm Mr. K with Mississippi Public Broadcasting, and we have another great lesson ready for y'all today. So I just wanted to point out these three words because this is what we're really focused on. These three words, hypertonic, hypotonic, and isotonic, these are three very important vocabulary words that we're going to be using a lot today and are very important for your understanding of biology. So let's go ahead and hop into it and figure out what these words even mean. So the first thing I want to tell you is that those three words all deal with osmosis. Okay, osmosis is something we talked about last time. What I need you to remember is that osmosis is the movement of water. Okay, that is a very key phrase to remember. If water's moving around, what's happening is osmosis. Okay, so what happens is that water moves across a cell membrane from an area of low concentration of solutes to an area of high concentration of solutes. We want to balance out how much water the solutes have. So if there's a lot of solutes and only a little bit of water, the water's going to rush into that area to kind of even it out. Okay, sometimes a membrane, remember membranes are semi-permeable, so sometimes water can move through them, but sugar can't. And so in that situation, we would use water, we would use this process of osmosis to kind of balance out the solutes and the water in a given solution. Okay, so the first word I wanted to talk about is isotonic. What you really need to know about this word, that prefix iso means equal. And so what's going on here is that the cell and whatever solution it is in has very similar solute concentrations, okay? What happens is this results in dynamic equilibrium. This is something we talked about last time. So remember, equilibrium, what does that kind of sound like? That kind of sounds like the word equal, right? So what's happening here is that the cell and whatever solution it is in has the same amount of solutes. But that doesn't mean the water isn't moving around at all. The water is still moving into and out of the cell, but it's at the same rate. And so what that means is that the cell is going to end up staying the same. This is the good type of solution. This is what we want to be in because our cells aren't going to change at all. Okay, so here's kind of a picture of that. You can see inside of this cell, the brown little circle there would be the cell, and it's sitting inside of a beaker that's filled with water. Okay, the cell and the solution has the same amount of solutes in it, so we would call that an isotonic solution. The water's moving in to the cell, the water's moving out of the cell, but they're in equal amounts, so the overall size and shape of the cell doesn't change. Okay. So again, this isotonic solution, we would kind of call this like a balanced condition, right? Because they're equal on both sides. There's going to be no difference between the cell and the environment. An example of this is like your blood, okay? You have all of these different type of blood cells. You got red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. They're floating around inside of your blood. Blood is mostly composed of a liquid component called plasma. Well, the solution, the plasma, and the blood cells, they have the same amount of solutes in them, and so we would call that an isotonic solution. The water moves across the membrane into and out of the cell equally, and so what that means is that the volume of the cell does not change. You can kind of see two pictures here. On the right, this is happening for both animal cells and plant cells. The water moves in, the water moves out. They're in equal amounts, so the size of the cell does not change. So isotonic is really what we want to be in, okay? But that's not always the situation that we find ourselves in, because sometimes those solutes is in a different concentration to our cells. One situation is called a hypotonic solution, hypotonic. What I really need you to remember for this, hypo, that prefix hypo means less than. So what do you call it when if you sit outside in the snow all day and you're getting really cold, your fingers might start to turn blue, right? That wouldn't be good. That's called a hypothermia, right? Hypothermia is when your body temperature gets too low. So hypo means lower than. What's going on here is that in a hypotonic solution, the concentration of solutes is lower than the cell that is inside of it, okay? And so what happens is the water moves into the cell. Because there's more solutes in the cell and less in the solution, the water moves into the cell. Here's kind of a little tip and trick I like to tell students to make it easier to remember. In a hypotonic solution, the cell's going to swell up like a hippo. So hippo, hypo, they kind of sound alike. So again, because there's more solutes in the cells than the solution, the water moves into the cell. That's going to make the cell swell up, and that's called, I tell people to remember that it swells up like a hippo. So hippo, hypo, they kind of sound alike. Okay, here's kind of a picture of what's going on. So we're in that same 10% salt solution. So this beaker is filled with salt water, 10% of it is salt, okay? But when we look at the cell has 20% salt. So there's more solute inside of the cell and there's less outside of the cell. That's why we would call this a hypotonic solution. There's less solute in the solution than there is inside of the cell. Because of this, the water is going to start rushing into the cell. We want to even out the water to solute ratio. So all the water is going to move into the cell. The cell is going to start to swell up. Well, what would happen if you take a balloon and you start blowing air into it, and you keep blowing air into it, and you keep blowing air into it? Eventually you're going to get in a situation where that balloon might pop, and that's actually what can happen to our cells if they are inside of a hypotonic solution. Okay, here's another picture about it, and I'll talk about that in more detail here in just a second. So a hypotonic solution, an example of this would be like a cell inside of fresh water. Okay, so think of like you have these saltwater fish. They love living in salt water, but they don't do very well when you start to move them into fresh water. The reason for this is that they're used to being in a very, very salty environment. If you move them into a freshwater environment, well, now all that water, they're in a hypotonic solution, all the water is going to start to fill into their cells. They're going to start to swell up. What can happen, this top picture right here, this is what can happen to our cells if you're in a hypotonic solution. It's called lysed. So a cell can lyse, which means it ruptures. It fills up with so much water that the cell actually bursts. That's going to be a very bad situation, right? Okay, so what's happening here is that because there's more solutes inside of the cell, the water rushes into the cell gets bigger, and it might even rupture. And that rupturing is called lysing, okay? Great job. So that's hypotonic solution. Now let's look at something else. This is called hypertonic solution. Okay, hyper. That prefix hyper is like the opposite of hypo. Hyper means too much or more than. And so in a hypertonic solution, this is when there's more solutes outside of the cell than there is inside of the cell. So the concentration of the solutes is higher outside the cell and lower inside the cell. What happens in this situation is the water exits the cell. It's going too high solute. So the water inside your cell is going to leave the cell. It's going to move into the solution that it's sitting inside of. So what I like to tell people is that the water exits the cell. Kind of think of the E in the hypertonic. Hyper has the letter E in it. That's going to help you remember that in this situation, the water is going to exit the cell. If the water exits the cell is going to shrink. Okay? So here's kind of a picture of that. So now the solution is 20% salt, the cell is 10% salt. What's going to happen is the water that's inside of that cell is going to leave the cell, move into the solution that it's inside of. Remember, water always moves towards high solute. So there's more solute outside of the cell, the water's going to leave, and that's going to make these cells shrink a little bit. Okay? This is really bad for plants, and I'll tell you why here in just a second. So a hypertonic solution, an example of that would be like salt water. So salt water has a lot of solutes dissolved in it. Okay? So what might happen is when that water starts to leave your cells, the cell's going to shrink a little bit. And this can be really bad for plant cells. They'll undergo something called plasmolysis, which is when they lose so much water that the cell kind of starts to shrink. So this is why if you are around plants or if you water plants or take care of them, sometimes you'll look at a plant and it looks like it's almost dead, like it'll be withered and all shriveled up. But if you just pour a little bit of water into it, it's going to absorb all that water and start to perk up and look really healthy again. So sometimes the plant cells just need a little bit of water. what will happen to us is, like, imagine you're at the beach and you're out in the ocean all day and you're swimming. Well, you're in a hypertonic solution because it's salt water, so after you're in the sea all day, sometimes your skin feels really dried out, and that's because all the fluids that you had in those cells, well, they're leaving and going into the ocean. So that's why your skin can kind of feel dried up after you spend all day at the beach. So y'all, great job. Thank y'all so much for following along with me today. We have some other stuff we'd love for you to work on, so make sure to give that your best effort, and I hope everybody has a great day.